Bob Iger is totally right about the timing thing, and that Star Wars needs to come out a little bit slower. By virtue of the fact of how many times I've watched it in the few days since I purchased it, I have to admit, I think Solo, from my point of view, is the most entertaining Star Wars movie that Disney has yet produced. For a variety of reasons. It does have a couple of low points. All the Star Wars movies, going back to the very first one, have their low, cheesy, kiddish moments. That's always been an aspect of the beast. I think a lot of the problems people have with the modern Star Wars movies and with the prequels comes down to expectations. But I think the real core problem is something else, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But Solo had a lot of good going for it. It was more of what I've been wanting, which is just kind of a low scale, small stakes adventure set in the Star Wars universe. Did they need to make it about Han Solo? No, they could have made a Dash Rendar movie, but from a business point of view, and also from, I guess, the perspective that they're still new to making Star Wars stuff, I can totally understand why. And the prequel thing, Star Wars seems somewhat doomed to be playing a lot of stuff out along the big gap in the timeline between the prequels and the classic trilogy for a long time to come. And they've now also set it up that there's another long gap to go back and fill in the blanks between the original trilogy and the new sequel trilogy. My expectations coming into the entire Disney Star Wars affair were low from the get-go. I only expected The Force Awakens to be a proof of concept movie, and that's all it is. And I find it somewhat disturbing that in the long term, the general audience seems to prefer the general concept movie of just, hey, we're just proving that we can make a generic Star Wars movie and do it competently without George Lucas being there to look over our shoulders, which The Force Awakens does, but it wasn't treading any original new ground. And how the general audience has reacted negatively to the follow-up to that movie, trying to tread some new ground. Rogue One, when I first saw it, I thought it was very enjoyable, but upon reviewings, more and more issues with that movie stand out to me, and I don't really feel compelled to rewatch it. And even though I rather like The Last Jedi, comparatively speaking, I never feel like, I want to sit down and watch that one. For one thing, there's now just so much baggage around it. It's kind of impossible to watch it clear-eyed without having to think about all these things that have been said about it, typically to the negative. It kind of spoils the viewing experience, I find. On the other hand, though, Solo's had a lot of negative stuff said about it, and I go in with a couple of low expectations about a few things and come out of it pleasantly surprised. Like I said, a nice small stakes, just a simple little heist movie. Maybe had one action sequence too much, but that's a problem with modern movie making in general right now, so I don't know how much I can lay that on their feet. Excellent Chewbacca work. Some of the best looking Chewbacca stuff I've seen ever, really. And Kira, Emilia Clarke's character, she's kind of a sneaker, but definitely I think she should qualify as one of the top villains and a really excellently written female villain. And she's a bad guy pretty much throughout the entire movie, just if you watch it right and look for little subtle things about how she plays herself. But she does love Han, so she helps Han, and it regrets what she has to do with Han at the end, but she's actually really the main bad guy of the film, and she's there with him the whole time. I thought that was brilliant, and she's never played that way. Ever. Even at the very end, there's no point where she suddenly whips off her masks and put on a funny hat. Yes. But she's also totally willing to ditch Han and go off to go meet Darth Maul. The movie could have stood to have a bit more with the Darth Maul in it. and they might have went ahead and played that up in the marketing. I think that might have maybe done a little bit more to get me to go to the theater. I'm not at all in the boycott camp, since I'm not anti-Last Jedi, but it was just too damn close. The general Star Wars community was still trying to choke down, hadn't even really begun to digest The Last Jedi into our pop culture's awareness and narrative of what Star Wars is. And Solo was out like, what, 5-6 months later? Just not nearly enough time. It's well known that George Lucas took a lot of inspiration from Joseph Campbell's work and research into the connecting threads of human mythology and storytelling, and used the classic hero's journey archetype to construct the story of Luke's journey to redeem his father. And I think part of why the prequels never sat right with the original Star Wars fan base in some ways is because they themselves were not based on that. The prequels are based on literal historical allegory. A lot of stuff about the Roman Empire, and a lot of stuff about, well, what at the time was modern post-September 11th American interventionism and all that kind of stuff, and corporate entities being manipulated by sinister powers who are working both sides to make profit and gain influence and all that kind of stuff. It was, like I said, the prequels were historical allegories, whereas the classic movies were a mythological allegory. And the reason why the first movies resonated so much is because of that common center of basic human storytelling it appealed to. It was not trying to be super original. It was being original in the presentation, but the story and plot line itself is something easy to understand and digest to audiences of all types. Because human beings have been telling stories just like that since before recorded history began. Some of our oldest myths, who knows how old they actually originate? We just know how old the first time it got written down. And who knows how massively distorted they were from the original events that inspired whatever these stories were. And so the sequel trilogy, it's trying to ape the classic trilogy more so than the prequel trilogy. And so it has a lot of overtones and aspects of the hero's journey. And a lot of people's complaints, particularly about Rey, revolve around her relation to the hero's journey and whether or not she's being properly taken through it and not skipping a bunch of early chapters of it. And I think the real problem is we've already had that story told within Star Wars. And so to repeat the classic hero's journey within Star Wars, there's no way to do it without undoing the trials and tribulations of Luke Skywalker, basically. Unless you were to set it at some massively different point in time. But 30 years later is not enough time, especially with Luke and his old compatriots are still alive and around at the beginning of it. What they should have done for Rey, and there's maybe a little hints of it, but they should have dove deeper into it, is they should have done a lot of research on just all sorts of mythological stories, particularly pertaining to those that had classic female heroes from ancient myth. Stories about Athena, stories about the Amazons, just Hippolyte, all this sort of stuff. And that's what they should have patterned Rey's story around. Still go to that mythological core thesis to be able to get that broad appeal so that everyone can relate to it, because it resonates, because this is a kind of story that we've evolved sitting around campfires listening to for like hundreds of thousands of years, possibly listening to these kinds of tales. Just find one that already was built for what we expect to have for a heroic female to be doing, and then give us a Star Wars version of that. I think part of why that was ignored is I don't think any of what people who are in control of the creative process of Lucasfilm have necessarily made that level of logical connection between the success of Star Wars and its adaptation of classic myth. I mean, they're aware of it, and just in terms of the hero's journey circle, but they're not thinking of how broader out they can go with that. The one thing I do kind of sense a little bit in Rey is at the very beginning of the movie, there's just kind of a hint of the thief of Baghdad. And in Star Wars Rebels with Ezra Bridger, it's not just a hint. He's very much the thief of Baghdad in the very first pilot hour episode. And they need to be focusing in and honing in on that kind of stuff, really. Is probably the way to go with this. Not try to adapt storytelling models. Like, you don't want Rey to go through Hercules' journey. Like I say, you need to find what human beings already expect of a heroic woman. I think, how much of it is just the copyright thing, the fake drive for originality. Everything's got to be original. Original can be problematic. Original is untested, and original flies in the face of human expectations. Storytelling is kind of like music in a way, or like any other kind of art that takes time over a span of time instead of being just something you see all at once. It's supposed to build up, and the constant trend we have of plot twists for the sake of plot twists, it creates all these movies where there's this natural build-up, the audience is expecting things to manifest in a certain way, and then that never happens because they got to plot twist us and something else happens. And at first these sorts of things like, oh my God, wow, that's so brilliant. But after a while, you just start to feel let down all the time if this is the common trope that all movies are doing. And the twist stops becoming special, and then you get into the realm of people learning to pre-anticipate their anticipations being subverted, which I think is dangerous territory for audiences, because that kind of just stuff is just naturally designed to spin off into negativity and to ultimately killing your franchise. In the end, it's sad that Solo has bombed for a variety of reasons, not just because of it illustrating the very real divisiveness that's going down in the Star Wars community, which I think is largely fueled by political posturing on both sides, and the proximity to the previous release, and the fact that his budget was bloated so high by all the reshoots that it was going to have to make way too much money that could be expected. Plus, from the get-go, I was certainly in the camp of people who, when I first heard that they were going to make a Solo movie, I was like, no, I don't want that. And it's a miracle of sorts that it's turned out to be a movie I enjoy so much. I never in a million years wanted a damn movie about young Han Solo. There's plenty of other things to do. Like I said, make a Dash Rendar movie if you want to have some smuggling adventures in the Star Wars universe with the underworld and stuff. But they didn't need to try to undermine Harrison Ford's performance. I did notice, I had guessed it in The Last Jedi with that whole thing where suddenly at the end there's like, oh, here Leia, I brought you Han's lucky dice. And I'm like, since when does he have lucky dice? Oh, I bet they're going to establish in Solo that he's had lucky dice this whole time, and that's why it's sentimental for Leia to look at his lucky dice, even though I have no visual recollection of, or certainly never any auditory recollection of anything being shown or mentioned in the original classic Star Wars trilogy about Han having dice. If there was any dice hanging off something, I never noticed them. And they certainly weren't pointed out in any sort of flashy way or having the camera in on it. So that was all kind of artificial. It's like I said, it's not that there's not things wrong with this movie. Thing is with very rare exception, pretty much every movie I already see a lot of cynical flaws in them. Which ironically, though, now makes me more, I think, immune to the knee-jerk anti-Star Wars reactions. I go into this, like I watch any movie. It's like, I mean, it's not going to be perfect because human beings are making it throwing money and computer graphics at problems that they can't normally fix just with acting alone, and to a point where they're over-relying on the computer graphics and the effects of the money they're spending on it. They're all over-bloated. Every last movie can't be $1 billion profit generating thing. I get that movies kind of need to be a business. Otherwise, they are purely propaganda, or they just don't exist at all. But I swear the wrong people are in charge of the studios and own these things. Maybe they shouldn't be publicly traded. Why on earth does Bob Iger and Disney have to answer to stockholders at all, or any of that kind of stuff? Whatever happened to personal ownership? Anyway, I guess that's another subject. Solo was great. Great, I tell you. Alden Ehrenreich was as good as you can expect. Chewbacca was fantastic. Some of the best Chewbacca action and acting and scenes I've ever come across in any Star Wars, outside of books. Lando Calrissian with Danny Glover, Donald Glover, Danny Glover's kid. Some of the complaints, I mean, go back to the core thing. That's all the Disney Star Wars movies have this cartoonish, slightly exaggerated quality to them, as if the people making them don't quite fully understand what they're doing, and so are trying a little too hard to, like, hey, this is Star Wars. And so, as ironic as it is to say, it kind of makes these movies feel a little less grounded. But they've been getting better as they've been going along. But the audience reaction to them seems to be going in the opposite trend. You're nuts. And I don't give a shit about your opinions about me being wrong.